ואני רוצה עכשיו להזמין את פרופסור מריאן פרקש. מריאן מזה 25 שנה היא חוקרת שותפה ראשית במרכז מחקר והכשרה ומרצה במחלקה למדעי הבריאות ושיקום באוניברסיטת בוסטון. היא כתבה יותר מ-90 מאמרים, פרסמה 4 ספרים, עשרות פרקים וערכות מולטימדיה בתחום. עבודתה על שיקום פסיכיאטרי והחלמה קשורה בשימוש באסטרטגיות אפקטיביות לצורך פיתוח ויישום של שירותים התומכים בבריאות והחלמה מהפרעות פסיכיאטריות חמורות. היא עבדה עם פרופסור וויליאם אנטוני מעל ל2 עשורים בפיתוח בסיס הידע שחלק ממנו נשמע עליו היום, והכישורים הנדרשים לתחום השיקום הפסיכוסוציאלי. היא הייתה אחראית בין השאר לסיוע בפיתוח הכשרה וייעוץ במסגרת ה-Veteran Affairs, המשרד הביטחון האמריקאי בארצות הברית, ב7 אתרים שונים בארצות הברית. היא עוסקת בפיתוח מתודולוגיות לשינוי ארגוני במסגרת מאמצם של ארגונים ומערכות אינטגרטיביות לאמץ חידושים בשיקום הפסיכיאטרי וההחלמה. והיא עבדה ועובדת עם ארגונים שונים בארצות הברית ובעולם, כמו ה-NIMH, המכון הלאומי לבריאות הנפש בארצות הברית, ה-World Association of Psychosocial Rehabilitation, ה-American Psychiatric Association וה-American Psychological Association, כל אלה גופים מרכזיים שאתם מכירים בתחום כמובן, בפרויקטים שונים. ויכולתי להמשיך עוד ועוד, היא שלחה, ראיתי המון פעילות, אבל נראה לי שעדיף לשמוע את המקור ולא אותי מדברת עליה. אז אני בכבוד רב רוצה להזמין את פרופסור מריאן פרקש שתכבד אותנו בהרצאה בשני חלקים. הראשונה על החלמה והנעה לשינוי בבריאות הנפש, והשנייה שתתמקד בהתערבות של מוכנות לשיקום. פרופסור מריאן פרקש, בבקשה.
בוקר טוב. That's the sum total of my Hebrew, so I hope you're impressed. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference, Ben Gurion University, ISPRA, the Ministry of Health, whoever else was involved that I might not know, for your kind invitation to come and spend some time with you today. I love coming to Israel. I was very surprised by the rain. I thought I was coming to the desert. It was not my picture of the desert. As our host mentioned, I come from an area in which we've had some snow, which you may not have heard about, but we've had 3.5 meters of snow, which is also very unusual. So I'm very happy to be here for many reasons. I'm happy to see old friends, and I hope that those of you I don't know, I will get to know, and we will become friends. We are all traveling this road together. So I've been asked to talk about 2 different things. The first is to talk about recovery, change, and readiness for rehabilitation, which I will talk about mostly recovery and rehabilitation in this piece. Then I think we'll have a break or something. Is this name tag on right side up or upside down? I can't tell. The letters are going the other way. Anyway, after the break, so you can imagine I can't read the agenda, but you can. I will talk specifically about rehabilitation readiness and the elements involved. So first I'm going to talk a little bit more conceptually about the notion of recovery, rehabilitation, and change, and then after the next talk I will talk more specifically about readiness. So let's begin. I want to thank the translator, by the way, who I know is Svia. I don't know your last name, I'm sorry, who comes from the world of disability rights, who's the perfect person to do the translation for me today. Thank you very much. I know what a hard job this is. And she and I had a conversation about recovery and the word in Hebrew for recovery that you've used, which is, with an H. I'm asking her not to use that word because I think it gives the wrong connotation. So we're going to use the word recovery in English, and I'm going to try to explain the concept, and hopefully over time you can come to some conclusion about what is the right word. We'll discuss it later. So let's start with why we started talking about recovery. The historical context in the United States of mental health was this. This was what we had to offer. And the perspective we had was that once you had a diagnosis of serious mental illness, that was it. You became someone other than one of us, and you became one of them, which allowed us to lock people up for decades without any real treatment to offer. Even when I did my dissertation in the 1980s, the average length of stay in our hospitals among the people that I studied was 16 years, the average, with a range of 6 months to 40 years. So once you were diagnosed, your life as you knew it was pretty much over. That's what we had to offer. Now, the U.S. historical context is perhaps also known in Israel. I found this storming of a psychiatric hospital from January 2013. I don't know if you know this whole story, but I think these experiences that we had in the U.S. are common around the world. And what was the basis of all that? What was the historical context? Well, diagnosis, as I said, implied lifelong deterioration. So it meant once you had a diagnosis of serious mental illness of whatever kind, it meant that you were thought to inevitably deteriorate. Diagnosis implied that the only role available to you was that of a service recipient, a client, or a patient. Pardon me. There was no other role that was relevant. And therefore, the categories of services that we offered is very limited. There were hospitals or supervised housing. There were day programs or sheltered work. That was the range of what we could imagine because we had this limitation of the filter that we were looking at the problem with, and that is the diagnosis, lifelong deterioration. So, in an attempt to make things better, our government invested in the infrastructure of the old facilities. The image of service was facility-based. So the services you got were tied to the buildings you were in. And it took a long time for us, because we're slow learners, to learn that what was needed was not more money for more buildings, but more funding for more people, both directly to support the individual with lived experience of mental illness and to support the people who were supporting them. Buildings were easy to see, but very hard to escape from. And building a life is always more difficult to point to, particular funding bodies. It's hard to have a plaque that says we gave this money if it's not a building, but you're investing in the people. So my colleague Bill Anthony used to say that deinstitutionalization, the process of moving people out of these facilities, provided more freedom in people's lives, but what we forgot to do was to provide more life in that freedom. So that was the background that we came from. The current thinking is that diagnosis does not predict success. We have a lot of studies that show that. In other words, knowing that someone has a particular diagnosis tells you nothing about the outcomes they can achieve. Some people with this diagnosis of schizophrenia don't do well. Some people with that same diagnosis regain their life, go on to have a job, a family, etc. The diagnosis does not predict success. We believe that the prognosis for someone may be an interaction of the impairment process, the local environment, the level of stigma, discrimination, acceptance, exclusion, etc., treatment processes that are available, plus the active agency of the person. Do you know what I mean by that? Slow down. The active agency of the person's capacity to act. We also learned that medication alone does not promote community functioning and success. This is one of those duh moments. But we spent a lot of money doing this particular piece of research. This was a huge study. Thousands of people were enrolled, and we discovered, guess what? Medication does not promote community functioning and success. And why do I say this in this way? Because much of the mental health service system had been reduced to a conversation about medication. Take your medication, take your medication, take your medication. If you don't take your medication, it's because you're not motivated, you're resistant, there's something wrong, blah, blah, blah. The best we know scientifically is that some medications at some dosage provide some control for some symptoms for some people. Does that mean not to take medication? No, but it means that it is not the answer. Medication alone does not promote community functioning and success. People with serious mental illnesses want and have many roles. That's the other thing we learned, another duh moment. People, in fact, were wives, homemakers, workers, students, and wanted to be. They wanted to be something other than service recipients and patients. So the service options that we had to develop had to include a full range of options in the real world, not just sheltered this or sheltered that. The other thing that we learned had to do with health promotion, and it added to the pressure to change the paradigm for services. We learned that promoting mental well-being is not the same as reducing mental illness. Think about that. Promoting well-being is not the same as reducing mental illness. Just like reducing your symptoms when you have a cold or a sickness at home is not the same as living a good life. So all of the techniques we had developed were about reducing mental illness, and then we were surprised when people did not have well-being. So what's the implication? The implication is that we cannot determine from the diagnosis what goals may be achieved or what kind of life a person will have. Very important. We learned that simply taking medication is not the key to successful community functioning and well-being. We have to have other tools. And we learned that services have to move beyond resignation and focus on outcomes beyond maintenance. Let me say that again. Services have to move beyond resignation. You know why I say that? Because many services in mental health had the notion that there wasn't a lot you could do. You can help people stay out of hospital, maybe, and if you did, that was good. To me, to us, that's a kind of resignation. This is all we can do. We are helpless. Yes? We have to move beyond resignation and focus on outcomes that are more than just maintaining people, because we know we can. So what is recovery then in this context? I thought I'd start by the story of Will. So Will said, "Since I was a child, I've struggled with extreme emotions, voices, and powerful out-of-body experiences. I saw cartoons projected on the ceiling, and my fear was sometimes so strong I became mute. I often hid away, alone and overwhelmed, and unable to describe what was going on. And I received a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder." And he goes on to say, which I didn't put up here, "The humiliation of being labeled this way threatened to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the hospital, shelters, group homes, and programs I was put into, I was socialized into the role of mental patient. I was encouraged to see myself as a broken invalid, to forget my strengths, and instead to focus on my weaknesses and vulnerabilities as evidence of being a defective human being. I learned to fear what was inside me as signs of my disorder, and to turn over the authority of my mind and experience to my doctors and therapists. Everything I did became a symptom. At age 26, I hit a breaking point and wandered the streets of San Francisco, hearing angry voices telling me to kill myself. I can't see this very well. Excuse me. I ended up in the locked unit of a public psychiatric ward. I was never asked if I wanted to go to the hospital or given options or support in figuring out what to do. I lost my job while I was in the hospital. But then I got very lucky. A social worker came and suddenly announced they were releasing me immediately. She said the public insurance that was paying for my stay had run out. So overnight, I went from being too sick to let go to being discharged. That's the American system. Now, however, I've been out of the hospital for more than 14 years. I got off medication, learned about nutrition, changed my diet to reduce my anxiety and sleeplessness. I watch for early warning signs of problems, have wellness tools to support myself, such as regular exercise, paying close attention to my patterns. I also began to consider the spiritual aspects of what I was going through, listening to the voices I heard and exploring their meaning. In my self-help support group, I met a peer whose father had a storage company. I got the job, and I have kept it for the past 5 years with the help of my coach. From time to time, I get sick again, but now I know what to do, and I know what to ask for when I need more support, so I get through it. What do I think about all that has happened to me? I might be different than most people around me, but being different also means being creative and sensitive. I stopped seeing myself as a broken person with no chance for recovery. I feel blessed. I have some friends, I have a job, I have a great psychiatrist, and most of all, I have a life that matters to me. That's recovery. That's recovery. So recovery is the process of moving from this state where what is most relevant about me is my mental illness, and the characteristics that are important to me are somehow disconnected from my sense of self, to this, achieving a meaningful life instead of achieving a prognosis. It's not that the illness is cured or disappears, but it becomes only one contributor to the characteristic degree of wellness, which itself is one of many other characteristics which create the experience of a person's journey to living a meaningful and purposeful life. So recovery is the process of seeing myself as a person who is ill and broken, with pieces that are disconnected from my sense of who I am, to having a meaningful life in which I am me, and one of my characteristics may be the illness that I have. What is recovery? It's a process, an individual's unique experience. The process of reclaiming a meaningful life. It's a variety of multidimensional outcomes, like gaining and regaining a valued role, reducing symptoms, increasing physical health, a sense of well-being, increased interpersonal relationships, connections, and self-esteem. A multiplicity of outcomes. Recovery is also a vision, or should be the overall goal, for services and systems. It requires the transformation of the paradigm within which services are delivered. So it's the experience of an individual's journey to a meaningful life. It's a series of outcomes that are multidimensional. It should also be the vision and goal for services. So when we talk about recovery, what is it exactly that's recovered? A meaningful life. And how do we do that? Through increasing a sense of self. And as Patricia Deegan said, whom some of you may know, is a wonderful orator, is a clinical psychologist with lived experience. She says that recovery for her is accomplished through hope, willingness, and responsible action, or the urge, the wrestle, and the resurrection. That was a nice alliteration. Okay. I'm not going anywhere. All right. Is recovery only for the very few? Some people say, oh yeah, well that's very nice. I'm sure that there are some people who recover, but most of my patients don't recover. You don't understand, the people I work with are really sick and nothing happens for them. What we know from this, and I'm not going to go through all of this, you can read it in the literature if you're interested, is that through a series of longitudinal studies lasting between 22 and 37 years across different countries such as Germany, Switzerland, Japan, the United States, the results are pretty much the same. About 1/2 to 2/3 of the cohort, in these cases the focus was on people with schizophrenia, recovered. Recovery being defined as the reduction or absence of symptoms, the reduction to no use of medication, the development of an integration into the family and into community, and the report of an improved quality of life. Those were the kinds of outcomes that were studied. So somewhere between 22 and 37 years of follow-up, interestingly enough, regardless of the country, regardless of the system, regardless of the services, this is what they found. So it is not for the very few. So why did mental health begin adopting recovery as a legitimate vision? Well, first of all, we've known about it in the literature for more than 40 years. If you remember, some of those studies were 1972. We've known first-person accounts much longer than that. People told us about their recovery. It's the national policy in many countries, like the US, New Zealand, the UK, are examples of countries that have all identified recovery as a national priority, some for more than 10 years at this point. We have research that's examined the concepts of recovery, the processes, and the outcomes across populations. If you recall, I told you those longitudinal studies were focused on individuals with schizophrenia. More recently, studies have been done similarly for people with other diagnostic categories to see if recovery is also possible for other kinds of diagnostic groups. And the answer is yes, it is. Okay, what do we know about the journey? Well, we know that recovery is difficult for providers to see. I want to explain this. John Strauss, and then later myself and my colleagues, did some descriptive analysis of stories that people told us about their recovery journey, and we tried to plot them out to see, is there a particular way that people go about recovering? And what we found in the first graph, if you like, is that some people go along and they maintain for a certain period of time, then they deteriorate, then they maintain again, then they suddenly get better, and then they deteriorate again. Okay? That's one path to recovery. The second is more of a stepwise. They go along for maybe 3-5 years in the same level. All of a sudden, there's a huge improvement, and then they stay at that level of improvement for several more years, and then there's another blip of improvement later on. And the last, which is my contribution, is the chaotic path to recovery. For people who constantly are in turmoil. They're constantly in turmoil, they're constant crises, taking back their life, more crises, more crises, more crises. But if you plot the graph over a period of 10, 15, 20 years, you see that even those with a chaotic course end up slowly improving over time. The red boxes represent the period of time that most providers get to see people. You might get to see someone in the normal course of things, anywhere from 6 months, 2 years, 5 years. The slice of that person's recovery journey that you experience colors your view of what's possible. So if you see the person in that first profile during their period of maintenance and deterioration, or in the second profile during the long periods of maintenance, or in the third profile, a slice of that chaotic journey, your experience as a provider is that recovery is not possible, because what you see is that slice. It's very rare that you have the trajectory of 15 or 20 years to take a look at what outcomes have been possible. So it's difficult to see. Why are the stuck places so stuck? Well, one of the reasons is that culture can increase internalized stigma. Why do people get stuck for so long? Do you know what I mean by internalized stigma? Yes? Okay. When the sense of family is strong, this is a particular research project that had this as a result, the inability to fulfill family roles and or seeking services shames the family unit. And that shame increases the person's sense of inadequacy and self-stigma. So sometimes the very thing that can support people, which is a strong family unit, also serves to increase that sense of shame and inadequacy. Why? Because individuals have the same values, the same sense of meaning, the same expectations of mental illness as the rest of the culture they come from. And that culture can become an obstacle to recovery. So some of the change that's required for recovery to occur has to do with community change, the change in the culture itself, the change of the perspective of a particular culture vis-a-vis mental illness. Thank you very much. Yes, I am getting hoarse. Thank you. All right. So another area that becomes important in trying to understand this path to recovery, besides stigma, which increases these stuck points, are the kind of tasks that people have to accomplish along the road to recovery, and the difficulty of those tasks. This particular description was identified by a group of researchers who also have lived experience of mental illness. And what they did was they also interviewed people and then analyzed their journey, and they said that typically recovery tasks include that of reawakening hope, re-engaging in life, developing a niche, a major role, developing secondary roles, developing a sense of purpose. And these are not easy tasks. These are not small tasks. These are not tasks at the level of making your bed, reawakening hope, for example, re-engaging in life. These are large tasks, and they are difficult to do, whether you have or don't have a disability. Another kind of description is this. This is a very busy slide. I don't expect you to absorb it. Just to know that this was another group of researchers who did similar kinds of qualitative analysis. And what they did was they tried to take people's story and identify moments in time that were of particular importance to people in their journey. And they identified these moments in time, a period in which people are overwhelmed by the disability that they're struggling with. They're just totally overwhelmed. They struggle with the disability, they live with the disability, and they live beyond the disability. And the transition from being overwhelmed to struggling with, to living beyond, are the moments that are the most difficult to accomplish, those transition moments. And, you know, if we had a couple hundred hours, I would go through what all of this means. But essentially, the arrows are to tell you that these are not stages. You don't go from overwhelmed to struggling with, to living beyond, even though that's intuitively clear. It happens all over the place. You go from being overwhelmed to living with, to struggling with, to living beyond, back to struggling, back to overwhelmed. So there's no linearity in this kind of path. These are simply moments of importance that people have identified. We don't fully understand it yet. So in all of this, what's the role of services? We believe the role of services is to coalesce around the person's recovery vision. What's the recovery vision? What I believe a meaningful life to be. What I see myself doing in order to have a meaningful life, beyond maintenance. What would a life of purpose be to me? And then the role of services is to coalesce around that vision and to contribute each of its unique interventions. So, focus on one recovery vision or goal, and secondly, to believe in the person no matter what. When we interviewed people over time, as I've mentioned before, the one thing that people said was the most critical element in their recovery was the presence of someone who believed in them no matter what, even when they didn't believe in themselves. That's different from being a coach and being, do you know what I mean when I say a rah-rah coach? It's different from having someone who says, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. It's a person who believes in you, believes in your worth, believes in your future, even when you don't believe in it yourself. That was the single most critical element that people said was important to their recovery. I'm trying to hurry up. All right. So, services need to be provided with a set of values in order to promote recovery. And I'm going to talk quickly about some of these values. So, services need to focus not on the diagnosis, but on the person, their strengths, talents, and interests. During your services, how many times do you ask about people's interests? How many times do you ask about the strengths that they may have? Or the talents they may have? You can walk into the middle of the road. So people kind of put themselves on the end and then everyone feels nervous about walking in the middle. That's all right, you can walk in the middle if you want. All right, so, in your record keeping, how many records do you have in which it explicitly asks you to list the talents the person has, the strengths they have, the interests they have? Or are your record keeping a compilation of limitations, deficits, and pathology? A person orientation which respects the person asks and engages the whole person. Not focused on coercion, but focused on choice. Remember, we talked about agency as a potent predictor of outcome. If you want people to have agency, they have to have choice. They have to learn to make decisions, have the right to have the individual power to make those decisions. So, inculcating services with choice becomes an important recovery value. Not focusing on compliance or following instructions, but partnerships, the democratic principles of nothing about us without us. To what extent are people involved in the design of your services? When I say people, I mean people with lived experience. To what extent are they involved in the design of services, in the delivery of those services? How many providers do you have with lived experience? Do you hire people who have mental illness as social workers, psychiatrists, doctors, case managers, etc.? The extent to which people are involved in evaluating those services. That's partnership. Nothing about us without us. A focus not on helplessness, we can't do anything, but on hopefulness. Without hope, there is no change. You know how you can walk into a mental health service and smell the hopelessness? Has that ever happened to you? Do you know what I mean when I say that? You walk in and you smell the despair. How can someone heal and re-engage in their life if that is the pervasive atmosphere? Inculcating your service with hopefulness is a very critical aspect of providing recovery-promoting care. Having the pathways to achieve a wide variety of goals is one way of inculcating hope. If you can only offer services for people that allow them to become clerks and You don't have hamburger flip. You have McDonald's, right? Flippers of hamburgers in McDonald's. That's fine. It's an honorable profession. But what services do you have for people who want to become doctors? What services do you have for people who want to go back to university? Become social workers. If you don't have an array of options, you are giving the message, this is only a limited slice of life that you can handle. All right. So, person orientation, choice, partnership, and hope are the critical values of recovery. What are some implications of these findings for mental health care? First of all, recovery is possible. Very important. And what does that imply? That simple maintenance, maintaining somebody in the community, is no longer an acceptable goal for mental health services. Since we know recovery is possible, we cannot accept maintenance as a goal for the service. Recovery can occur with professional help, peer intervention, or without professional help. We don't know who recovers without professional help. We know that at least a third of the people do. Some people say they recovered despite professional help. So we know if that's true, and we know that empirically, then leaving care may be a sign of health. If you're in a service where the atmosphere is hopeless, where the options are limited, where people don't really believe in your strengths and talents, leaving care may be a sign of health. People have a level of expertise themselves. That's the other implication of this finding. So part of your job as a provider is to engage the expertise of the individual, their expertise about their recovery journey. Recovery can be described. It's not just a vague idea or experience, and I gave you some of those descriptions. Recovery is multidimensional, means that it has to be a vision for many different kinds of services, for crisis intervention, as well as for rehabilitation, for treatment services, as well as case management. And lastly, since it's multidimensional, reducing symptoms is important, but not enough. Recovery-oriented services must be based on a set of recovery values. So it's not just what you do that makes a difference, but how you do it that makes the difference. Evidence-based practice is important, but evidence-based practice plus values makes best practice. Think about those values that we talked about: partnership, person orientation, choice, hope. If you take evidence-based practices and you base them on those values, you will promote recovery better than if you just deliver the intervention without the values. Recovery should be the overall goal. Interventions have to address well-being, not just illness. In European countries, they've done this for many years. We just began offering physical fitness programs as part of mental health services because we are people of the mind. We forgot the body. And as Judy Chamberlain, who was a friend of mine, once said, you cannot recover if you're dead. So it's important to have physical programs and attend to physical health. We know that having a diagnosis of serious mental illness predicts 25 years less lifespan because of endocrine problems, because of cardiovascular ailments. So fitness programs, health programs, nutrition programs all become important to overall recovery, well-being, spiritual well-being, as well as emotional and intellectual well-being. Families and neighbors play a role, so it's important to include the natural community in your overall recovery plan. So with the few minutes that we have, I want to give you hope this lecture will end someday. I want to talk about the difference between recovery and psychiatric rehabilitation. Psychiatric rehabilitation is a recovery-oriented approach. It's one of the array of services. I hate to see people sitting on the stair when there's all of these chairs in the middle. Will you allow your colleagues to pass so they can sit down? Anyway, it's just me, I'm sorry. Okay. We'll take a moment to allow people to sit. I know you're anxious. Okay, how is recovery and rehabilitation related? Recovery is a systematic approach based on rehabilitation is a systematic approach based on recovery values that contributes to overall recovery by developing relationships where the individual is the expert regarding his or her own recovery. So in a rehabilitation relationship, it's not about the expert telling the person what to do, but about facilitating the sharing of expertise from the other's point of view. Rehabilitation facilitates individual success around a specific set of recovery goals, and that is choosing, getting, and keeping a preferred role. Every service has a different set of outcomes that are important. We'll talk about that in a minute. Rehabilitation is focused on choosing, getting, and keeping a preferred role, which involves both the person, changes for the person, but also changes for the environment and changes for the society and the culture around the person. So, talking about what I said before, recovery is the overall mission. There are many different kinds of services, each with their own specific responsibility, if you like, to contribute to recovery. The role of rehabilitation is to focus on role functioning and role performance. Not because that's all that there is, but because that's the job and the set of tools that rehabilitation has. So psychiatric rehabilitation is the interconnected process of engagement, choosing, getting, and keeping valued roles. So how do we understand the changes implied in recovery and how do we promote them? We know that the recovery journey is nonlinear. We understand some people change, some people don't change. Some people want to change, some people don't want to change. Some people sound like they want to change and don't. So the question is, well, how do you know the difference? Who's committed to change? How do we promote that person's willingness to change? We know that variables such as socioeconomic status, age, gender, duration, intensity of symptoms, none of these predict who will change and who will not change, who will continue with the treatment process, who will drop out, who will succeed and who will not. So let's look at some of these theories of change that have been very popular in the mental health field, in the behavioral health field, if you like. The earliest model was the health belief system. And this was a model looking at how to change health behaviors, developed in attempts to get the population to accept preventative screening. This model was focused on indicators such as perceived threats, perceived benefits, internal or external cues to act differently, and perceived barriers to treatment. It was the earliest model that we had in terms of impacting beliefs and change in health. Another very prominent theory was that of the social cognitive theory, Bandura's theory. And that was focused mostly on reciprocal relationships between people, the social environment, and the behavior to be changed. And the theory in that particular model of change had to do with the impact of the person, the environment, and the behavior. The last one that's perhaps most often used these days is Prochaska's trans-theoretical model of behavior change. This describes stages of change, and it explains readiness to change, as I said, stages in a cycle, rather than looking at individual factors. So if you look across these models, you see that Hello? All of them see the environment as influencing behavior change. All of them see that the environment plays a role in behavior change. All of them emphasize the importance of self-efficacy. So how does this relate to recovery? Well, some people have attempted to put learning about recovery into Prochaska's phases, for example, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance, in order to understand better how recovery occurs. So let me just say that we're at the beginning of this research. We need to understand a lot more to know whether that's going to make sense or not. Whether putting the recovery journey into these kinds of phases of pre-contemplation, contemplation, action makes sense. I'm just letting you know that's one thought, that's one strand. All of these models have similarities that have implications for rehabilitation and other services. So, what are the implications across these models? The perception of self and the environment is key, therefore the client is the expert. Sound familiar? The difficulties in change have to be identified by the client. These are implications across the models based on all of these different points of view. Shared decision-making and increased self-efficacy yields better outcomes for change. Developing self-management skills in functioning, health and wellness improves the likelihood of change. So, much like basic values of recovery-oriented service, what we see across these change models is the importance of the person as the expert, the importance of involvement, and the importance of self-determination. So if we look at psychiatric rehabilitation, relative to change, we know that people want more participation in the process and more attention and respect from their support providers, something we have learned over and over again. And we know that it's important to have decision-making supports and aids that can empower and enable people to make difficult, important choices about all aspects of their lives, suggested as the key to recovery. So, what is the importance of all this that I'm telling you? Because it sounds kind of scattered. What I'm saying is that when I come back after the break to talk about readiness for change from the rehabilitation perspective, it's based on a synthesis of all of this information. And readiness for rehabilitation is a decision-making support. It's an aid to help people make the important choice, and in this case, the choice is whether to change or not. Okay, so what's the definition of rehabilitation readiness? It's a process to engage the self in identifying the extent to which the person is willing and prepared to begin a structured process of rehabilitation. That is, a structured process of choosing, getting, and keeping a valued social role. Why am I emphasizing this? Because the process that we identified in rehabilitation engages the self in identifying the extent to which they're willing to make a change. It's not a checklist where you as the provider observe a person and then come to a determination. The process is designed to have the self, the actor, to identify the extent that they are now, at this moment, ready and willing to actually make the change. We're going to talk about this kind of a profile more in depth later. However, notice that the process of determining readiness is not about yes or no. It's not that I am ready or I am not ready. There are some ways in which I'm ready, there are some other ways in which I am not. This includes the perception of the person, him or herself, and the environment, as well as their perceptions, the environment's perceptions about the process. So even with this profile, the person has a decision to make about what they want to do and how they interpret the strength of their readiness at the moment. So the point is that readiness is a profile that has many components around which you can be more or less ready, and that the interpretation of that profile is up to the person themselves relative to what it means for them and this enormous task of making a change. Let me summarize what I've said. Recovery is multidimensional, nonlinear journey over time that can be facilitated by providers, family, friends, other peers, supporting the individual in a way that is person-oriented, reflects full partnership, honors choice, and fosters hope. Rehabilitation is a service which contributes to recovery by focusing on helping people to achieve valued roles through the provision of skills and supports. The process of recovery implies change over time, maybe over decades. A rehabilitation service asks a person to face change in order to achieve a valued role. And rehabilitation readiness builds on learning across models of change and helps people determine how willing they are to begin that confrontation. Thus endeth the sermon for now. Thank you for your attention.
Your question was, why did I ask the translator
To use the word recovery in English rather than the word, what was the word? Haflama. Well, first of all, because it's hard for me to pronounce. No. My understanding of that word is that while it is broad, it gives people, it has the connotation of recovering from an illness, of like recovering from surgery, recovering from cancer, and that's not what we're talking about. Recovering, reducing symptoms, dealing with the impairment is 1 out of 15 different indicators. I was talking to someone before the presentation, and they asked me what this word, how this word has been translated into other languages. And the translation of the word reflects the development of understanding about the concept in the country. So I give you an example because Max asked me this question. In French, how many people know French? 1 or 2? All right. In French, the people tried to translate this with the word récupération, which is a recovery is what you do in the medical profession. What we call it now in French is rétablissement, which is re-establishing yourself. And recovery is more the sense of re-establishing yourself with a sense of meaning and purpose. You can overcome your illness and not recover. Yes? You can, if you think about it, we talked a lot about recovery in Boston after the marathon bombing. You know, we had a bombing, and I know you know this much better than we do, because you're much more used to having to deal with this. But for us, this was a major event, as you can imagine. There is recovering from having, for the survivors, having lost both their legs. Having a prosthesis, you know, there was a mother who lost both her legs and her daughter lost one leg. They had to have an artificial leg. But they were not recovered. They did not take up their life. Their life was about going to the hospital, getting the prosthesis adjusted, paying the bills, and grieving about the bombing. And it was very clear when you spoke to them that they had fixed one problem, which was getting the prosthetic device so they could stand up, but they had not recovered their life. That's why I'm worried about this word, Hama. I think you have to be careful about what you call things because it has power. I don't know if there is a word like rétablissement. In Dutch, it's herstel, which has to do with reclaiming identity. I don't know anything in Hebrew, as you can tell, so I have no advice. What we did in these other countries with the translation was we used the word in English until there was collective agreement about what could represent that kind of idea. And you want me to stop?
Yes, and thank you very much, Marianne.